My name is Dr. Joachim Dengler, and I thank you very much, Tom, to be here again. And a short few remarks to my bio. I'm a PhD of physics of the University of Heidelberg, and then I did a postdoc in image analysis, partly at the AI lab of MIT. And during that time, I wrote the habilitation thesis, which is a precondition in Germany to, if you want to become a professor. It is called Foundations of Optimal Model Building. And so you will not be surprised too much later on in the session when we start model building, which is a kind of favorite of mine. And so in the earlier days of my research, I worked together with the Harvard Medical School. I made also a model, did a brain matcher for diagnostic purposes, and then later on I worked in fingerprint analysis, and after that in IT consulting. And I came back to climate research since about 5 years, and in that time I also wrote two peer-reviewed papers on the relations between emissions and concentrations. And the second paper is the foundation of what we will talk today. I also have a blog. The name is in German, but half of the content is in English. Yeah, it is, as you can imagine, two Ks in it, Klima instead of climate, Klima minus Fakten, that sounds like facts, yeah, and it's .net. We'll talk about what they call the carbon cycle, and essentially there are two approaches to try to understand the carbon cycle, yeah. And the first approach, what I call the bottom-up approach, or you could also call it the P counting. Yeah, you try to analyze each individual effect of a complex system and try to put together all those elements and see what comes out. Yeah, and the effects which in question are the transfer of CO2 from the atmosphere through the ocean surface and back. That depends on temperature, depends on surface roughness, and a lot of other things. Yeah. And then the reactions of CO2 in salt water. Yeah, there is a chemical equilibrium between CO2, between carbonatic acid, and hydrogen carbonate, or the carbonate salts, yeah. And many may have heard of the so-called Revell factors, which limits the conversion of CO2 into the other components. And so there are complicated relations, and people make models of that, of these details. Then there is the transfer to and from the deep ocean. And there is one famous model, the so-called Burn model, for the transfer into the deep oceans by means of diffusion. And and they showed that, or they assumed that this transfer is very, very slow. And then you need models for the marine biota carbon cycle and for the land biomass carbon cycle. And you can imagine you get lots of models with lots of variables. And for every model and variable, you make assumptions. And then you try to put together to make a big picture, yeah? And the end result of the currently used models of the IPCC, for example, are so constrained that they predict ever-rising CO2 concentrations unless anthropogenic emissions are reduced to zero. Yeah. And of course, some people doubt that. And I mean, the amazing fact is that these models are they are so constrained that they assume that the capacity of the ocean is effectively only 4 times that of the atmosphere. Yeah? Whereas in reality, from the sheer volume, the ocean is 50 times as large as the atmosphere. Yeah, so there is a big discrepancy from what we would naively expect and what the models predict. Yeah, and so therefore I tried another approach. That's what you call the top-down approach. You take the system as a whole. You don't know all the details about the system. You make no analysis of the individual effects, but you do analyze some long-term time series of what goes in and what comes out. Yeah, we can measure the concentration in Maouna Loa. Everybody knows that. Yeah, and from that you can also derive the concentration growth. What we also can measure pretty well are the anthropogenic emissions. We know less about the natural emissions. We know that they are very large, but they cannot be measured in the same detail as the anthropogenic emissions. What we also can measure is the global temperature, in particular the sea surface temperature, and I tend to prefer to use the sea surface temperature because 70% of the Earth's surface is ocean, yeah, and so the sea surface should be the dominant part. Yeah, then we will see and that it is plausible that all the sink effects where CO2 goes into the ocean or into the plants are approximately linear with the atmospheric concentration. As physicists, we can make use of mass conservation, which means that nothing can vanish. If there is a reduction in CO2 in the atmosphere, it must go somewhere, either into the plants or into the ocean. And therefore, we can create a very simple model of a linear system. Now we come to the actual data. Here we have the CO2 emissions and the CO2 concentrations. Yeah, and what we see is an apparent strong correlation between CO2 emissions and concentration, in particular after 1960. We know that the data before 1960 are considered not very reliable, but the other question is what can be learned from large concentration? And the trouble is you cannot really learn a lot from it because correlation does not say anything about causation. Yeah, we all know the famous example between the storks and the babies. If the number of storks goes down, the number of babies also goes down. Yeah, but people may draw the wrong conclusions from that. Yeah, so in general, from a large correlation, typically what you find that this opens wild speculations. Yeah. Okay, then we have the next data, the CO2 concentration and global temperature. Yeah, and again, after 1960, we have a strong correlation between CO2 concentration and temperature. And as most of this community know, this picture serves as the main evidence for the climate narrative, meaning that CO2 concentration apparently causes temperature. But such shortcut conclusions, I would say, are foolish. Yeah. First of all, how do we interpret the obvious temperature cycles between 1850 and 1975? Yeah, we can see clear cycles here. And whereas the concentration goes up smoothly. Yeah. And the other part, which we will come back later on, how do we interpret the very large short-term variability of global temperature, whereas CO2 concentration is very smooth? Yeah, here we have large variations in the temperature, but only very smooth CO2. And if we assume that CO2 would cause temperature changes, then we would assume to have equally smooth temperature. At least we definitely know there must be at least a second factor or other factors. Yeah. Okay, but now how can we introduce a really proper scientific approach? And as I mentioned, physics gives us an important constraint, and this is mass conservation. And you can imagine mass conservation as a bank account, yeah? All emissions, meaning anthropogenic emissions and natural emissions, are the input. And the absorptions are the output, yeah? And so concentration growth is the result of both anthropogenic emissions and natural emissions minus the absorptions, yeah? And here physicists like short abbreviations and formula. So the concentration growth, the G, is anthropogenic emissions plus natural emissions minus absorptions. Yeah, this is our main equation on which we base everything. And if we change the variables, yeah, and from those four variables, we can measure two of them. Yeah, anthropogenic emissions can be measured pretty good, and concentration growth can also be measured. Yeah, and so we change the variables a bit around because emissions are larger than the concentration growth. We take the difference of those, and this is on the other side absorptions minus natural emissions. And this difference we just abbreviate. We call it the sink effect, yeah, the natural sink effect. And so we illustrate this here. The blue curve are the annual emissions. The orange curve are the annual concentration growth, quite wiggly. And if we subtract both of them, because this difference goes somewhere, yeah? Because only the concentration growth remains in the atmosphere, and the whole difference must go in the oceans or in the plants. And we draw this with the green line, yeah? And to avoid any misunderstanding, when I used this picture before, someone said, but your sink effect is going down. No, it's not. It's going up, yeah, because here we have a negative scale here on the left, yeah. So And I only have drawn it like that because otherwise it would get mixed up with the concentration growth, and the picture would be confusing. Just for the clarity of picture, the sink effect is drawn with a negative scale. Yeah. And what is important, these relations, what you see here, this is not a model. This is a consequence of a law of nature. Yeah. We are not modeling here, we are measuring and applying a law of nature. What we will do, we will make a model of the green line eventually. But we know, before we start modeling, we know that it is increasing all the time on the average, and it is approximately following a line. We don't know yet exactly how it grows, but it is growing, and also what we see, it has many distortions, yeah, in short-term variations. Okay, now in order to find a law, or in order to be able to create a model, we do look a bit, what do we know about absorptions? First, we start with the oceans. Yeah, we know that absorptions in the cold oceans is governed by Henry's law. And this means that the concentration of CO2 in the water is proportional to the partial pressure of the CO2 in the atmosphere, which is also concentration. This means, the consequence of this, the rate of ocean absorption is proportional to atmospheric concentration, which is exceeding the equilibrium concentration. Yeah, when both concentrations are equal, there is no absorption. Yeah, but any concentration in the atmosphere which is exceeding the ocean concentration, then you get a proportional effect. Yeah, and the emissions from the warm oceans are also controlled by Henry's law, but we also know that Henry's law is temperature dependent. Yeah, this we remember. And then we look at photosynthesis. First, the absorption part. The absorption by photosynthesis is also a linear function of CO2 concentration. And we must know, here we have the concentration on the x-axis, and we know that the 0.02 means 200 ppm, yeah, and we are currently approximately at the 0.04, and the maximum expected concentration which we can think of will be probably 600 ppm. So we are within the range between strictly 280 and 600. That is here, and in this range, both for the C3 plants and for the C4 plants, we have a linear function of CO2 concentration. Well, C4 plants are nearly flat, but a flat line is also a linear function. Yeah. So the main point I want to make is we have a linear function. Yeah. And also photosynthesis also depends on temperature. Yeah. The warmer the better, until 30 degrees centigrade. Yeah. So because photosynthesis depends on enzymes, and you can see the ideal temperature is 30 degrees. So for most countries, there is still quite a bit margin upwards, yeah, before plant optimum is reached. Yeah. And we can say 1 degree centigrade rise of temperature means 7% of more growth, plant growth. Yeah, that means we can feed 7% more people, with 1 degree centigrade rise. Yeah, this is a message to all those who have problems with global warming. Yeah. And now we look at the emissions from the biological carbon cycle. This is more complicated because 50% of the absorptions are immediately emitted. Immediately means within a day, due to respiration, because plants also need energy for doing all the jobs they need to do. Then I was surprised to find that 25% of plants' growth are eventually processed either as food for animals and humans, as wood for furniture or firewood, or other purposes. Yeah, so a lot of it, 1/4, we could say, is used for purposes for us humans. Yeah, and then we have 24% decomposition with different time constants. Yeah, this is fast composition when you mow your lawn. Yeah, it takes just a few weeks till this decomposes, or the leaves of the trees take 1 or 2 years. Yeah, and in the Maouna Loa curve, you can see the decomposition. Yeah, in the how when the CO2 goes up in the winter, then you can see that the decomposition is active. What is important to know that absorptions are consistently larger than emission when there are no big catastrophes in nature. And the difference is still growing. Yeah. So here is a message for all those of us, of the listeners, who say that, oh, the natural emissions are so large that anthropogenic emissions are drowned in that and are not significant. That's not true, because natural emissions, which come from the biological sphere, are always smaller than the natural absorptions. The biological world is a carbon sink that includes also animals and humans. Yeah, and that's the other message from here, that biology is a sink, and therefore it does not contribute to carbon growth in the atmosphere. Yeah, and this is a message for all those who think you can solve the carbon problem by slaughtering cows or not having babies. Yeah, that's really the wrong message. Because the biological world is a carbon sink, and it is greedy for carbon. Yeah. Eventually, there may be that there will be a saturation. I mean, you can observe that in a tree. When you look at an individual tree, in the beginning, it uses little CO2, and then there is a phase of maximum growth where most carbon is converted into the wood and to the leaves and to the branches. And then when a tree gets old, again, the carbon creation is reduced again. Yeah, so we can expect that within, I don't know, 100 years, there may come a saturation of the biological sink effect, but we can be sure that the biological sink effect will not saturate before we reach a constant carbon CO2 concentration. Yeah, and for the next 60 years, we can still expect some growth of concentration in the atmosphere. Okay. After this excursion, we now can assume, or we know that the sink effect should be a linear function of the concentration. And certainly it's related to concentration and not to emissions. Yeah, and you see, because some people argue that the cumulative emissions are a predictor for temperature. Yeah, there is a famous graph using this relation, but the sink effect cannot be related to emissions because a plant in the United States doesn't know if there is a coal power plant being started in China. Yeah, there is no communication between emissions and the sink effect. Yeah, the plant or the ocean surface only knows the local concentration. Yeah, therefore our sink effect is proportional to the concentration and possibly an additive constant. And when we do a regression of the sink effect, assuming this relation, sink effect is A times concentrations plus a constant C, then we have about approximately 2% of the concentration and a constant of minus 5.2 ppm. And the minus sign means this stands for natural emissions. Yeah, so we have approximately constant natural emissions of 5.2 ppm, or you have to multiply it with 2.1. That means approximately 10 gigatons of carbon are the natural emissions over a year. That is net emissions. Yeah, during the year there are much more, but they are compensated by the absorptions. So we model the concentration growth. Growth is emissions minus sink effects. So it's emissions minus 1.0183 times concentration plus the 5.2 ppms. This is the formula for concentration growth. So what we see here, the sink effect is matched very well by a linear function of concentration, but as we also see, there is a considerable variability because concentration growth appears noisy, yeah, but noisy just means we don't know the reason, yeah, and now we look for this reason, yeah. And from our equations, we can also compute hypothetical natural emissions. Yeah, these are again the difference between emissions and concentration growth minus the absorptions. But we model the absorptions now with our constant A times concentration, and then we get a residual. Yeah, these are the deviations estimated natural emissions from the constant emissions. Yeah, here the green line, that would be the constant emissions of 5.2 ppm. Yeah, the blue line, these are the measured emissions. Yeah, and if we smooth them, we get a kind of cyclic curve. Yeah, and it was Roy Spencer who stated that this residual depends on El Niño. Okay, that's true. Yeah, and you can make very good predictions using El Niño, but as a physicist, I must say, in physics, in physical laws, we don't know El Niño. We only know temperature. Yeah. So this brought me to the idea to make a temperature-dependent sink model. Yeah. Instead of the simple sink model, which only depends on concentration, we extend this to make it also dependent on temperature. Now we come back to our diagram. We have a problem. Concentration and temperature are highly correlated. In mathematics, you call this collinear. Yeah, and this is what you hate when you do regressions. Yeah, but temperature has a very large short-term variability. Yeah, we see all these wiggles, and this is what we will make use of now. Okay, now we do a little trick. Yeah, because temperature is so correlated with concentration that we really cannot know what is the cause. Yeah, because if we add two variables which are causally which are correlated, then it's hard to detect the effect of each one. Yeah, so we decompose the temperature. We know that global temperature is correlated to CO2, and here we say we don't care and we don't know what is the cause. Yeah, why are they correlated? We don't know and we don't care. But we split the global temperature into a linear function of concentration, into the part which is correlated and into a part which is not correlated, into the residual. Yeah, so we split. We have the correlated part that is again a linear function of concentration, and the total temperature is the sum of the correlated part and the non-correlated part. And as we said, the temperature effect of the correlated part cannot be distinguished from the concentration effect. We can expect, therefore, only to see an effect from the residual temperature, yeah, from this green temperature. And this green temperature is very similar to El Niño. Yeah, and so definitely Roy Spencer was right. But now when we try to do a temperature-dependent model, we introduce this decomposition, and then we separate, and here we see, and then we replace the temperature-dependent, the correlation-dependent part of the temperature by this expression, by this concentration-dependent expression, and have the residual temperature here. Yeah, and then we put the constants together. We have now a part which is proportional to concentration and a part which is proportional to the residual temperature plus a constant. Yeah, and so we have a different equation, and this is exactly the simple linear model enhanced by a trendless temperature changes. Yeah, because you see that the residual temperature has not any trend anymore. And you see, this explains why we do not find any temperature dependent in the simple linear model. Yeah. And the trendless temperature changes, that's exactly the definition of El Niño. And if we extend the model like this, we can now compare the results. Yeah? When we make the simple sink model, we see that that there are the model is very good, but you can see deviations, rather small deviations since 1990. Yeah, but here they vanish again, and here they come again. When we introduce the temperature-dependent model, we first approximate with the orange curve. And what we see, there is a perfect fit until 1990. Then we get a deviation in 1990, and then it stays parallel with the actual concentration. Yeah. And if we go back here, we see that after fitting the temperature part also to the sink effect, we can see that we get quite a bit of the wiggles are explained by temperature, but there is one big deviation around 1990 which cannot be explained by temperature. And again, also this part has been discovered by Roy Spencer, and he said this is due to El Niño. Yeah, in 1990, there was the El Niño explosion, and there is a big spike in the sink effect. Yeah, so a lot of CO2 is extracted from the atmosphere due to this volcano explosion. Yeah, people might wonder, because normally you would naively associate volcanoes with more CO2, but El Niño produced a large carbon sink. Yeah? And how can this be explained? Yeah, and Roy Spencer explains it in such a way that he says El Niño created a lot of dust in the atmosphere, and this dust has a refraction effect on natural light. Yeah, so you get more diffuse light than direct light after the and if a leaf or even a PV module is not optimally adjusted to the direction of the sun, then it only catches the diffuse light. Yeah, and it seems that if there is quite a little bit of diffuse light in the atmosphere, this has a very positive effect on photosynthesis. Yeah, so photosynthesis has been increased for 2 or 3 years after the El Niño explosion. Yeah, that's a great effect. Now we come back to our diagram. So when we also include this sink pulse in our calculation of emission growth, then we get the green line, and the green line rather perfectly fits the blue line. Yeah? It only deviates slightly after 2010, and maybe we need to detect another effect for that. What we also can see here, the actual concentration growth is always smaller than our model. So our model is not optimistic, but it is a conservative model. The model explains very well the actual concentration growth, much more precisely than the linear model did. And also, we can be on the safe side that the model is still not over-optimistic, but it is conservative. Always the actual concentration growth is, if there is an error, it's always smaller than the model predicts. Yeah, so we are not doing an over-optimistic estimation. Okay, now let's look at what we call the equilibrium relation. This is a bit of hypothetical, because equilibrium is only when we have zero concentration growth. But currently, and for at least for the next 60 years, we will have concentration growth. And also equilibrium also means that anthropogenic emissions are zero. Yeah, and also we are far away from zero anthropogenic emissions. Nevertheless, it's quite interesting to look at that. When we look at the equilibrium, then with the estimation parameters, the concentration for temperature anomaly T equals 0, we would get 309 ppm. And the pre-industrial expected temperature from 280 ppm would correspond to minus 4.4 degrees, but that's not really Celsius, that's the temperature anomaly. Yeah, when we look at the temperature, you can see it is these temperatures which we use from the British Met Office, etc. They don't give us absolute temperature, but temperature anomalies, and you can see that -4 pretty well fits to the pre-industrial age. Yeah. Also, that's also interesting, but again, this only applies when equilibrium is reached. A concentration sensitivity by temperature. So if we don't have any emissions, any anthropogenic emissions, if there was only temperature, then we would have a sensitivity of 66 ppm for each degree centigrade. Yeah. So you could say that possibly half of the concentration growth which we had in the industrial age could be accounted by temperature. Certainly the other half is accounted for by the anthropogenic emissions. So I suppose we will have interesting discussions on this point. Yeah, and for this temperature dependence, it's absolutely clear that temperature causes CO2 concentration growth, and for this part, it's not the other way around. This does not exclude that there is a causality in the other direction, but we certainly have the causality from temperature to CO2 concentration. This is for certain. Yeah. Again, I don't claim that there is no greenhouse effect. I don't want to be called a climate denier. Yeah, there is a greenhouse effect, but the greenhouse effect is certainly pretty small. Yeah, we can discuss this. I discussed this in my last talk. Now the question is, when do we use the temperature-dependent model? With current data, I must say the effects of temperature-dependent models are very small. They are hardly visible. And for predictions, we do not have any advantages. Because one reason is because we don't know what future temperatures will be. Yeah. But things get interesting when correlation between CO2 concentration and temperature breaks. Yeah. For example, currently we have a temperature growth which is faster than expected from CO2 concentration. Yeah, that is, but we need to wait for 1 or 2 years in order to get more reliable measurement data in order to draw useful conclusions from this. Yeah, so but this is something which people may look at in the next year or so. Also interesting, when there are no anthropogenic emission data, then temperature is the only active predictor. So example, when we analyze historic data, for example, ice core data, and this is what we will do. Also, the temperature-dependent model is interesting because it gives us a better understanding of the carbon cycle. I will talk about this also a bit. First, let's analyze the ice core data of the Vostok ice core. Obviously, because these data are between, here these 4 periods, I used only 4 of the 8, are between 10,000 years and 400,000 years old. Yeah, so we look quite a bit back into the past. We don't have anthropogenic emissions, but we have temperature and concentration data. And if we apply the same model which we have used for current data, the concentration growth or the sink effect, because there is no anthropogenic emissions, it's only minus G, the sink effect, and we model that again with our linear model in concentration temperature. And the model parameters are now different. Yeah, we have a sink effect proportional to carbon concentration of 1.3%, not per year, but per 100 years. Yeah, and we need to speculate, what does this mean? My simple hypothesis is that this sink effect is the permanent conversion of CO2 into limestone. Yeah, because when it's converted into limestone, it's kind of gone forever. Yeah, I'm not quite sure whether this is correct. We would need to look at even larger timescales to validate this, but this is one idea for a preliminary hypothesis. So, and obviously there is a temperature factor which explains the variability of the CO2, because it wanders between 200 ppm and essentially 280 or 300 ppm. Yeah, and this is all explained only by temperature. Yeah? And there is also a constant emission, which is from natural emissions. Yeah, yeah, and you can see the model works very well on these data. We can look at the equilibrium relations when we have zero emission growth. Then we get this relation between concentration and temperature. For T equals 0, we get 300 ppm as a zero concentration. And although the temperature scales is not necessarily the same as we have for modern data, yeah. So, but it's still very close, yeah. Because for modern data we have 309 ppm, and here we have 300 ppm. And now the concentration sensitivity by temperature is much smaller than in modern times. You remember we had 66 ppm per degree, and here we have only 14 ppm per degree. And this discrepancy, one explanation is that actually, to be honest, it was Ferdinand Engelbein which pointed out this to me in a recent comment. He said we can assume that the 14 ppm per degree would be the contribution of the ocean, yeah. Whereas in 100 years, the biological world comes into an equilibrium. So we have the concentration sensitivity by temperature, which we could attribute to the ocean. And this fits actually quite well to the Henry's law. Yeah. So, but again, here, no scientific study has been made yet. This is also subject for the future. If anybody feels the calling to do that of the audience, I'm most welcome. Here, obviously, temperature causes CO2 concentration, not the other way around. And there seems to be also a unanimous, near unanimous understanding in the mainstream science, what the Vostok data are concerned. At least 4 or 5 scientists agree that the causal direction is from temperature to CO2 concentration. There is only one group who still clings to the CO2 hypothesis and creates fantastically large sensitivities that way. Okay, now we come to the improved understanding of the carbon cycle. You see, you remember that we played around with the constants, with the model constants, and when we really interpret it not as an El Niño but a temperature effect, we get a very large sink effect of 4.4%. If you remember, the normal linear model has only 2% of sink effect, which is proportional to concentration. Yeah, but the large sink effect is compensated by a large constant natural emissions, and also temperature-dependent natural emissions. Yeah, so the whole effect has the same sink result, but the actual sink effect is very large. As an experiment, I also did this calculation not with yearly but with monthly data, and here the effect is even larger. We get 5% sink effect from the concentration. So CO2 actually vanishes very, very fast into the ocean and the plants. And also the temperature effect is considerable. Yeah. So we get, for the concentration growth, I use now the more conservative number. Concentration growth is emissions minus 4.4% of concentration plus 2.9 times the temperature anomaly plus 13.6% ppm of constant natural emissions. So also from this formula, we see anthropogenic emissions always contribute to concentration growth. Yeah, there is no way to debate them away. But the sink effect is large from the and from the science we conclude concentration dependence refers to absorptions. Temperature dependence refers to natural yearly emissions, and the constant also refers to natural yearly emissions. And now we have an interesting observation. In the 1950s and early 1960s, there were the atom bomb explosions, yeah, and in 1963 there was the bomb test treaty. There was a treaty to stop all atomic tests, at least those in the atmosphere. And so we have a kind of ideal emission pulse of radiocarbon, of C14 here. And one can analyze the decay of this emission pulse. And if we do this analysis, we find here we have a logarithmic scale. The decay is, the yearly absorption rate is pretty exactly 4.76% per year. Yeah, that also includes the thinning effects, you see, because we did have anthropogenic emissions also in that time. So, and these anthropogenic emissions they don't contain any C14 because that's old carbon from oil and gas and so on, etc. There is no more C14 in that. And so even if we include the dilution by anthropogenic emissions, we have a time constant of 21 years that corresponds to a yearly rate of 4.76. And this is pretty much exactly the same rate as we discovered when we do the temperature-dependent model. Yeah, so I take this as a very, very good confirmation of that. Also, why do we measure the high absorption rate for radiocarbon? That's because the natural emissions, they emit carbon from the ocean or from plants, which is typically old carbon, which is much older than this emission pulse. Yeah, yeah. If for example, if a tree decays, then it takes, let's say, 50 to 100 years until all the carbon dioxide comes out. Yeah, but the bomb tests have the bomb test impulse is from 1963. Yeah, so we only investigate young carbon with the bomb test data, and also from the ocean. Most of the carbon in the ocean is also very old and hardly contains any carbon, or only from the equilibrium C14, which comes from the cosmic rays. Yeah. So we actually analyze the carbon cycle. The 4.4 to 5% is the so-called downwelling carbon. And from this 5%, 3% are upwelling from the ocean, and this is also temperature dependent. And so the difference are the 2% which we can measure with our linear model. Yeah. So and as long as temperature and CO2 concentration is correlated, the linear model gives us the same results as the temperature-dependent model. And one more conclusion: we now know that the yearly temperature dependence is 2.9 to 4 ppm per degree centigrade. And so if we have temperature variations, also the concentration growth varies in the same way. And so we can explain the large variability of concentration growth by means of the temperature variations. And just a little story in this context: this effect was responsible for wiping out the effect of the COVID-19 emission reductions. Yeah, because when we look at the year 2020, in the actual concentration growth, we get a minimum, a spike downwards here. But exactly in this year, we had an upward peak from the temperature-dependent part. Yeah, and so it was the COVID-19's reduction was overcompensated by the temperature dependence. And so everybody was disappointed that there was nothing could be seen in the concentration growth. Actually, the concentration growth was higher than before, yeah, in 2020. Yeah, so there was a large. You remember all the news headlines that nothing could be seen from the emission decline. Yeah, but if you look carefully, if you take away the temperature dependence, you can see very well the emission, the concentration growth minimum due to the COVID effect. Yeah, this can be seen if you take away the temperature dependence. Yeah, if you use our model for calculating the concentration growth. Yeah, that was, I think, a nice story. So we can really see some real world effects, but as I said before, under the current conditions, these real world effects are very, very small. You have to look very carefully to see this temperature dependence. Yeah, so the final conclusions: the temperature dependent model leads to downwelling absorptions and to upwelling emissions, natural emissions of CO2. The absorptions predominantly depend on the CO2 concentration, and natural emissions depend predominantly on temperature. As long as CO2 concentration is correlated to temperature, there is no real visible long-term temperature trend of the final CO2 sink rate. But subtle effects can well be explained by temperature dependent. And the absorption rate is consistent with the bomb test C14 absorption. Although natural emissions are large, this does not change the consequences of anthropogenic emissions. The temperature-dependent model gives a good explanation of the ice core data. And as an outlook, that was the remark also from Ferdinand Engelbein. He said it is promising when analyzing the C13 data. That's another isotope of carbon. This may help to clarify, to differentiate the role between oceans and photosynthesis, because photosynthesis absorbs C13 less than the C12. Yeah, so we can get a discriminating effect. But I haven't done any analysis of that. So this is an outlook also for others who want to engage in that. Okay, here are my sources, all the data, and my 2 publications around this subject. So, and that's the end of my talk. And if you have some questions, we can discuss.
All right. So one thing that really jumped out at me is on, I think, slide 9, where you're talking about optimum photosynthesis on Earth is more like 30 degrees centigrade, 86 degrees Fahrenheit. We're supposed to worry that the Earth is too warm at 15 degrees centigrade, maybe, but I guess we shouldn't, huh?
Yeah, well, I mean, depends to whom you talk. If you talk to the people in Dubai, the workers are allowed to stop working when the temperature exceeds 55 degrees.
Right. But even in Dubai, the high temperatures probably aren't going up nearly as much as the low temperatures, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I mean, I see most of the Earth's surface, one can look at the temperature maps, the most does not exceed 30 degrees. Yeah. And also in the oceans, that it's very interesting. That is subject to another talk, or you might invite Willis Eschenbach. He's the guy who talked about the ocean thermostat. Yeah, there is a thermostat in the oceans. Actually, there are 2 of them, which prevent the ocean to become warmer than 30 degrees. Yeah. What a miracle of nature, yeah. What a miracle of nature, yeah. And again, the land which is close to the oceans, I mean, inherits this from the oceans, and as soon as you get away from the deserts of the Earth, the temperature is definitely average temperature is hardly warmer than 20 or 25 degrees. Yeah, so we have still upward margin what nature is concerned. Yeah, I mean, I know in Washington D.C. when I was there, in summer you get out of the underground or the tube, you enter it's really boiling hot, yeah. But for humans, you can have air conditioning, and in Dubai they use a lot of air conditioning, definitely. So it becomes bearable for humans, yeah. So it's not that you, and also I was in India, most of India. I was in India at a time when there were no air conditioning, yeah, and it was hot in summer, yeah, but you can survive it, yeah. It's not that you can't survive it, and as I said, for the plants, they thrive at 30 degrees, yeah.
Yeah,
at least most plants.
Yeah, my dad used to be a corn farmer, and he said you could kind of hear the corn growing on really hot Minnesota days. And I think
Yeah.
I've read from the University of Iowa that for corn, 93 degrees Fahrenheit is the optimum temperature, that corn really
Yes.
likes it hot. And you said here
Yeah.
on your slide that generally at these temperatures, we're experiencing 1 degree C rise is 7% more growth. It's kind
Yes.
of a rule of thumb. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. This rule of thumb depends on something where I did not find an English equivalent. We call it the RGT rule. Yeah, that is a well-known rule in chemistry. That means for each 10-degree temperature rise, reaction velocity or reaction speed doubles. Yeah, yeah, and if you reduce that to 1 degree, you get the 7%. Yeah, that is in German the RGT rule. Yeah, but these are German words: Reaktionsgeschwindigkeit and temperature. Reaction speed in English you would say RST rule, reaction speed temperature, but it's not called like that. I don't know the English expression. I was looking for it and I didn't find it.
Right. And I think my last question is about Patrick Moore argues that maybe humans saved humanity because over the course of a long time, atmospheric CO2 was going down from maybe 5,000 plus ppm.
Yes.
And it was just continuing to go down. And you're saying biology is a sink. So do you think without humans that maybe atmospheric CO2 would have continued to go down until it kind of threatened life on Earth? Or what do you think?
No, it doesn't. If you look at the Vostok data, yeah, we have eight periods where CO2 concentration wanders between 200 and 280 ppm, and a very slow decay. Yeah, very slow decay. Yeah, which I don't know exactly. Probably the decay is even smaller than the Vostok suggests. Yeah, but and so the concept approximately goes like that. Yeah, most of the CO2 is stored in the ocean. Yeah, and the ocean has a fantastically high capacity. Yeah, and so the ocean, if you don't have anthropogenic emissions, you will eventually get an equilibrium between ocean carbon content and atmospheric carbon content. Yeah, and the statement of my talk today is this equilibrium between ocean and atmosphere is temperature dependent. Yeah, if you are in an ice age, it goes down to 200 ppm, as we saw. And when it warms again, then it goes up to 280. But this is the natural maximum. And so I agree with Patrick Moore that anthropogenic emissions, I would call it like that to appease a bit the people on the other side, is a blessing in disguise. Yeah, it seems to be a pollutant, but all the measurements which we make, and this is what Patrick says, yeah, are positive. Yeah, we have fantastic greening. Yeah, and of the sensible people also on the other side, nobody disagrees about the greening effect of CO2. Yeah, the modern argument of the alarmists is but when emissions stop, then the greening also stops. Yeah, and so my first argument against it is it's not emissions which count, but it's concentration what counts. Yeah, and so the more sensible people say when concentration grows, then the sink effect stops. Yeah, but again, there I would say maybe the biological sink effect will be reduced when we reach an equilibrium. This sounds quite sensible to me, but it takes a lot of time. Yeah, so we have 100 years of time. Yeah, before the photosynthesis parts will decrease. Yeah, and this doesn't say anything about the ocean. Yeah, the ocean has very strong, robust mechanisms. Yeah, for example, the marine biota, they sink in the literal sense, also in the gravitational sense. Yeah, when you see new phytoplanktons grows, and when it dies, by gravitation, it goes down to the ocean floor and becomes carbon, yeah, or carbonate, yeah, limestone, yeah. So these are the effects, and we have a lot of, also nature makes a lot of limestone, yeah. You see, the corals produce limestone all the time, yeah, and limestone is, in my view, gone forever, yeah.
Okay, maybe I didn't understand you, but I think Tom Segalstedt had this experiment you could do in a lab where you can somehow have CO2 precipitate or form calcium carbonate and fall to the bottom of a beaker. Do you think anything is happening like that in the oceans where calcium carbonate's being formed without life being involved at all? Or no?
Well, I don't know whether it's, I mean, corals are living beings, yeah, and they produce, I think, the most limestone. By the way, also when you eat an egg, it produces limestone, or the hen produces limestone. With each egg which you eat, you produce 5 grams of solid CO2. Yeah. Yeah, so you sequester 5 grams of CO2 with each egg you eat. And now you can calculate how many eggs you need to eat to compensate for your next flight to Hawaii.
Fantastic. All right. On that note, maybe we'll wrap up. Anything else you want to say before we finish up?
No, I think that's enough for today.
All right. Thank you very much. Super interesting stuff. Thanks for coming on again, and I hope to have you on again when you're ready.
Thank you for your great patience with me today.
All right. Talk to you next time. Goodbye.
Okay. Bye-bye.